Welcome to today's deep dive. Today we're going to be cracking open Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Oh, yeah.
It's a fascinating look at how our minds work.
Yeah.
We actually sent over some excerpts from this.
I did.
We're excited to dig into it.
It's a classic. I mean, it's a book that really makes you think about how you think and how you make decisions.
Right, and this core concept of the book is that we have these two systems of thinking that are kind of battling it out in our minds all the time.
Right.
System one is the fast intuitive one. It's what helps us navigate everyday situations, like, slamming on the brakes when someone cuts you off in traffic.
Right.
But then there's system two, and this is our slower, more deliberate system. This is the one that we engage when we're, solving a complex problem or, doing your taxes or planning a trip.
Right.
But these systems aren't perfect.
Yeah.
And Kahneman points out that system one, in its quest for speed, often relies on these mental shortcuts called heuristics.
Yeah.
Which can lead to some predictable biases in our thinking.
Yeah. One of the most striking, I think, is the availability heuristic.
Oh, yeah.
Where we judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind.
Right.
Which means we often overestimate the frequency of things that are vividly reported in the media, even if they're statistically rare.
Like his example of initially assuming that adultery was more common among politicians than physicians.
Right.
Simply because politicians' scandals are more likely to make headlines.
Exactly.
Yeah, he was like, oh, wait a minute, I have to actually think about that,
Yeah, you get caught up in what you see.
Right.
It's a reminder that our gut feelings, while sometimes useful, can also be incredibly misleading.
Absolutely. Then there's this fascinating concept of priming.
Yes.
This idea that subtle cues in our environment can unconsciously influence our thoughts and behavior.
Right.
And I was reading about that study, the Florida effect, where just seeing words related to old age made participants walk more slowly afterwards.
It's a remarkable example of how our behavior can be influenced without us even realizing it.
It makes you wonder how much of our behavior is truly conscious and how much is driven by these unconscious influences.
Right. It challenges the idea that we are fully rational beings in control of our decisions.
Absolutely. And this all kind of ties into this concept of cognitive ease.
Yes.
Like our brains crave easy, fluent processing.
Yeah.
So things that feel familiar or fit a neat narrative or are easily processed just feel true, even if they're not.
Yes.
Which explains why repetition can make something seem more believable, even if it's completely false.
Think about advertising jingles or political slogans.
Right.
The more we hear them, the more they seem true to us.
Yeah.
Even if they're completely lacking in substance.
Yeah. It makes me wonder how much of what I believe is simply a result of what's easiest for my brain to process.
Sure. It's a bit humbling, right?
It is. Then there's this idea of the illusion of understanding.
Yes.
Our minds crave coherence so much that we create these narratives to explain the past, even if events were largely random. It's like those business books that try to distill formulas for success from studying successful companies.
Right.
But are they really seeing something real? Or is this just our minds trying to impose order on chaos?
It's tempting to try to extract these clear-cut lessons from the past.
Right.
But we often overlook the role of luck and circumstance. Our desire for a coherent narrative blinds us to the complexity of reality.
This has huge implications, not just for understanding success, but for how we view history, current events, even our personal lives.
It's the narrative fallacy in action.
Yeah.
We love a good story, and our brains are wired to find patterns and create meaning, even when the evidence is weak or contradictory.
So how do we avoid falling into these traps?
It takes conscious effort to step back from our intuitions and question the narratives that we create.
Okay.
We need to be comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty, and be willing to admit when we don't have all the answers.
It's so much of this boils down to recognizing that our brains aren't perfect information processors.
Exactly. We are constantly influenced by emotions, biases, and mental shortcuts. The key is to be aware of these influences and develop strategies to mitigate their impact on our decisions.
Which brings us to this concept of loss aversion.
Yeah.
Where the pain of a loss is psychologically more powerful than the pleasure of an equal gain.
It's true. We hate to lose even more than we love to win.
And this aversion to loss shapes our behavior in profound ways.
Absolutely. Think about the endowment effect experiment.
Okay.
Where people suddenly value a simple object they own much more highly than an identical one they don't.
Oh, wow.
Simply because they possess it.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
It really highlights the power of ownership.
Right.
and how loss aversion can bias our decisions.
It makes sense when you think about how much stronger the feeling of loss is
Right.
compared to the feeling of winning.
Exactly. Loss aversion is a powerful force
Yeah.
that we need to be aware of if we want to make rational decisions.
And speaking of how things are presented, Kahneman shows how the way a decision is framed can drastically alter our choices, even if the underlying options are identical.
Right.
He calls this framing effects.
The classic example is the Asian disease problem,
Okay.
where people prefer a program that saves 200 out of 600 lives when it's framed as a gain,
Yeah.
but they'll favor a program with a 400, 600 chance of death
Wow.
when it's framed as a loss.
That's fascinating how just the way the information is presented can have such a profound impact.
Absolutely. The power of language.
Right.
How we can be swayed by subtle wording and presentation.
This has major implications for everything from, marketing and advertising to public health campaigns and political messaging.
Oh, sure.
We have to remember that we're not always as rational as we think we are.
That's right.
Our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world, and they often rely on these shortcuts and biases that can lead us astray.
Yeah. The good news is that by understanding these biases, we can start to make more informed decisions and live more fulfilling lives.
Okay, now for one final mind-bending concept before we wrap up part one.
Okay.
Let's talk about the two selves, the remembering self and the experiencing self.
Okay.
It's like we're two different people sometimes.
Kahneman makes a compelling case for that.
Yeah.
He points out that we have a self that experiences life in the moment, and then a self that remembers and evaluates those experiences later.
Right.
And those two selves don't always agree.
I remember reading about that colonoscopy study where patients who endured a longer procedure with a less painful ending actually had a better overall memory of it.
Yeah.
Even though they experienced more total pain.
Exactly. The remembering self tends to focus on the peak and the end of an experience.
Interesting.
And often neglects the duration.
Yeah.
This can lead to some interesting discrepancies between how we actually experience something and how we remember it later on.
So short, intense burst of joy might leave a stronger memory than a longer period of mild contentment.
It makes you realize that our memories are not always accurate reflections of reality.
Right.
They're shaped by all sorts of biases and distortions.
Which is why it's so important to be mindful of both our present experiences and the stories we tell ourselves about the past.
Absolutely.
Okay. That was a lot to unpack in part one. We explored the two systems of thinking heuristics and biases, priming cognitive ease, the illusion of understanding loss aversion framing effects, and the remembering self versus the experiencing self.
It's amazing how much ground we've covered.
I know. It's amazing how much ground we covered just by scratching the surface of Kahneman's work.
And we're just getting started.
I know.
Welcome back to our deep dive into thinking fast and slow.
It's amazing how much we've already learned about the quirks of human thinking. I feel like I'm starting to see, everyday decisions in a whole new light.
Yeah, and in this next section, Kahneman delves into some really interesting experiments about how we make judgments.
Okay.
Especially when facing uncertainty. Do you remember that line length experiment?
The one where people had to judge the average length of a set of lines.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember reading that, but remind me why it's so important.
It illustrates beautifully how System 1, our intuitive system, can make surprisingly accurate judgments effortlessly.
Right.
You just glance at those lines and boom, your brain has a pretty good estimate.
Yeah, it's like our brains are constantly making these quick calculations without us even realizing it.
Right, and this is big, but System 1 is also prone to errors.
Okay.
Especially when we're dealing with statistical information or probabilities.
Okay, you're talking about that experiment with Tom W., the fictional graduate student.
Yes.
Where people had to rank the likelihood of him being in different fields of study.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That experiment is a classic example of how we can be misled by our reliance on stereotypes.
Right.
People completely ignored the base rates.
The actual proportion of students in each field.
Right. And they focused solely on this description of Tom W., which was crafted to sound like a stereotypical computer science student.
So even though statistically there were far more humanities students than computer science students,
right,
people still ranked computer science as the most likely field for Tom W.
Precisely. They fell victim to what Kahneman calls the representativeness heuristic,
Okay.
where we judge probability based on how well something fits a stereotype.
Yeah.
Even if that stereotype ignores crucial statistical information.
So we're essentially replacing hard data
Yes.
with a story.
A story.
that fits a familiar pattern,
Right.
even if that story isn't statistically sound.
Exactly. And this isn't limited to just students.
Okay.
Kahneman found that even experienced researchers can fall prey to this kind of thinking.
Oh, wow.
Believing that small samples are more representative of the population than they actually are.
Huh.
He calls this the law of small numbers.
That's a bit unsettling, isn't it? To think that even experts can be misled.
It is. But awareness is key.
Right.
By understanding these biases, we can start to question our assumptions
Yeah.
and look for more reliable evidence before making judgments.
And this has, major implications for real-world decisions,
Right.
from scientific research to financial investments.
Absolutely. Think about the stock market, for instance.
Okay.
Kahneman challenges the traditional economic view of investors as perfectly rational actors,
Right.
showing how our emotions, biases, and cognitive shortcuts can influence our financial decisions.
It's like we think we're being strategic and logical,
Right.
but really we're driven by fear and greed and, a whole bunch of unconscious biases.
Precisely. We tend to be overconfident in our ability to predict the market,
Yeah.
leading us to trade more frequently than we should.
Right.
And we often hold on to losing stocks for too long,
Oh, yeah.
hoping to avoid the pain of realizing a loss.
That's classic loss aversion.
Exactly. It's like we'd rather cling to the hope of a turnaround
Yeah.
even when the odds are stacked against us.
Right.
Because the thought of losing is so painful.
So maybe the best investment strategy is sometimes to just ride the market and resist the urge to constantly tinker with your portfolio based on your gut feelings.
That's a strategy many financial advisors recommend.
Yeah.
And Kahneman's work certainly supports that approach.
Interesting. Okay. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about another area where Kahneman's insights have been incredibly influential,
Okay.
the psychology of happiness.
This is where his work gets really fascinating. He distinguishes between two types of happiness.
Okay.
The happiness we experience in the moment
Okay.
and the happiness that we remember and reflect upon later.
Right. It's like how you might remember a vacation fondly, even if there were some stressful moments.
Precisely. Our memories are often shaped by a few key moments,
Okay.
what Kahneman calls the peak and the end of an experience,
Yeah.
and we tend to neglect the duration.
So a short, intense burst of joy might leave a stronger memory than a longer period of mild contentment.
Exactly. And this can lead to some surprising discrepancies between how we experience life
Right.
and how we remember it.
It also suggests that it's really important to focus on creating positive peak experiences.
Yes.
Especially towards the end of an experience,
Yeah.
if we want to shape those lasting memories.
And it highlights the importance of being mindful of both our present experiences
Right.
and the stories we tell ourselves about the past.
It makes you wonder how much of our happiness is really about how we choose to frame and remember our experiences.
A great deal, it seems. And Kahneman also delves into the role of money and happiness.
Okay.
His research shows that while having enough money to meet basic needs is essential for well-being,
Yeah.
beyond a certain point, more money doesn't necessarily lead to more happiness.
That old saying, money can't buy happiness.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to see that research actually supports that.
Exactly. What seems to matter more is how we spend our time,
Yeah.
whether we're pursuing goals that are meaningful to us.
So chasing wealth for its own sake might not be the most fulfilling path.
Right.
It's about finding a balance between material well-being
Oh.
and pursuing activities and relationships that bring us genuine joy and purpose.
That's a great takeaway from this section of the book. Now let's talk about one final mind-blowing concept
Okay, I'm intrigued.
before we wrap up part 2.
Okay.
It's called the focusing illusion.
The focusing illusion. Okay, what's that all about?
It's the tendency to overestimate the impact of any aspect of life that we happen to be focusing on at the moment.
Okay.
Like imagine asking students in California and the Midwest to rate their overall life satisfaction.
I'd probably assume the California students would rate themselves as happier, given the, sunshine and the beaches and all that.
That's exactly what most people assume,
Right.
including the students themselves. They're focusing on the perceived benefits of California's climate.
Right. But is that really what the research shows?
Not at all. When researchers actually compare life satisfaction scores,
Okay.
there's no significant difference between the two groups.
Wow. That's really surprising.
Uh-huh.
So the focusing illusion led people to overestimate the importance of climate and their overall well-being.
Right. But when you look at the bigger picture,
Yeah.
other factors matter more.
And this illusion applies to all sorts of things, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like we might obsess over getting a promotion thinking it will make us incredibly happy,
Uh-huh.
but then find that the novelty wears off quickly
Right.
And our overall happiness hasn't changed much.
When we focus on one particular aspect of life,
Yeah,
it's easy to blow its importance out of proportion.
it makes sense. So the key is to kind of step back and consider the bigger picture.
Yes.
And not get so fixated on one thing
Right.
that you lose sight of everything else that contributes to your well-being.
Exactly. Recognizing the focusing illusion can help us make more informed choices about what we prioritize in life.
Okay, that was another jam-packed segment.
Okay.
We've explored everything from judgment under uncertainty
We did.
to the complexities of happiness
Yeah.
and the dangers of the focusing illusion.
It's amazing.
I know Kahneman's work is so rich with insights.
It makes you rethink how you view the world
Right.
and your place in it.
Yeah, it's a real mind bender in the best way possible.
I agree.
Welcome back, fellow deep divers. We're wrapping up our deep dive into Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. It has.
Exploring all these,
Yeah.
quirks of the human mind.
Yeah, it's amazing how much one book can change the way you see the world.
Yeah.
We've talked about those two dueling systems of thinking.
Right.
System 1, the quick, intuitive one.
Yes.
And System 2, the slower, more deliberate one.
Right.
And we've seen how these systems, while incredibly powerful, can also lead to predictable errors in judgment.
Absolutely.
So the big question is, what do we do with all this knowledge?
Yeah.
How can we use these insights from Kahneman to make better decisions and live more fulfilling lives?
Yeah, that's where his work gets really practical. Because he doesn't just point out the problems.
Right.
He offers solutions.
Yeah.
He provides a framework for recognizing our own biases and developing strategies to mitigate their impact on our choices.
Like with the availability heuristic, for example. Knowing that we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled.
Right.
We can make a conscious effort to seek out a wider range of information before making judgments.
Exactly. Instead of just relying on those vivid anecdotes that pop into our minds,
Yeah.
we can look for, statistics, data diverse perspectives.
Yeah.
We need to challenge those initial assumptions
Right.
and dig a little deeper.
Yeah. And when faced with a complex decision, we can engage System 2
Yes.
by slowing down, breaking the problem into smaller parts, and really considering the potential consequences of each option.
Right. It's about being more deliberate and thoughtful in our decision-making process.
Right.
Kahneman even suggests using checklists
Oh, really?
to guide us through complex decisions,
Interesting.
helping to ensure that we're considering all the relevant factors.
Checklists.
Yeah.
It seems like something so simple, but I could see how it would force you to slow down and think things through more systematically.
Yeah, it can be surprisingly effective.
Yeah.
Checklists help reduce the influence of emotions and biases
Right.
by prompting us to consider all the relevant information in a structured way.
Another strategy we talked about was reframing decisions to focus on potential gains rather than potential losses,
Yes.
especially when we're dealing with loss aversion.
By consciously shifting our perspective, we can reduce that fear of loss
Right.
and become more open to taking calculated risks that could ultimately lead to greater rewards.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just a matter of how we choose to look at a situation.
Right. And knowing about framing effects, we can become more critical consumers of information.
Absolutely.
We can pay attention to how things are presented and ask ourselves, is this framing influencing my perceptions more than the actual content?
Right. It's a powerful tool for persuasion.
Yeah.
But when we're aware of how framing works, we can start to see through those manipulations
Right.
and make more objective judgments.
We can learn to spot manipulative language, misleading statistics, biased presentations.
Yeah.
We can seek out sources that present information in a balanced and objective way.
Yes, and be more willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
Yeah.
It's about being open to new information and different perspectives, even when they challenge our existing beliefs.
A recurring theme throughout the book is this idea of humility.
Yes. Kahneman reminds us that we should be wary of our own intuitions, especially in situations where we lack expertise or experience.
Right.
We need to acknowledge the limits of our own knowledge
Yeah.
and be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
Which is hard, right? Our brains crave certainty.
It is.
But sometimes the best answer is, I don't know.
Absolutely. Admitting when we don't have all the answers is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Right.
It allows us to approach situations with more curiosity and openness, which ultimately leads to greater learning and growth.
Well, fellow deep divers, that brings us to the end of our exploration of Thinking Fast and Slow. It's been an incredible journey into the world of human cognition.
It highlights the power and the limitations of the human mind.
Right.
We're capable of incredible feats of reasoning and creativity, but we're also susceptible to a whole range of biases and illusions.
Yeah, the key is to be aware of these biases and to develop strategies for mitigating their impact on our lives.
And to never stop questioning, exploring, and challenging our own assumptions.
So the next time you're faced with a decision, big or small, remember what we've learned about those two systems battling it out in your mind.
Yeah.
Remember those mental shortcuts, those biases, those illusions that can lead you astray.
Absolutely.
And above all, be humble.
Be curious.
Be open to new information.
Yeah.
And never stop learning.
Right.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into thinking fast and slow. We encourage you to explore the book yourself.
Yes.
And discover the fascinating insights it has to offer.
And until next time, keep those minds curious and engaged.